welcome to the Yukti Roundtable. Tonight we're going to be talking about some issues regarding law and debt restructuring. But before that, let me just give a brief introduction. So Yukti is a plural research forum supporting working people's movements and people's struggles for democracy and justice in Sri Lanka. The forum is dedicated to promoting understanding of people's lives, critical analysis, and providing alternatives to neoliberalism. My name is Kadirgamar, and today I'm joined with Ahilan Kadirgamar, a senior lecturer from University of Jaffna, and Ermiza Tegal, attorney at law. And so welcome. Very glad that you all can be here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. And, as I mentioned, this is going to be more like a conversation, a roundtable. But just to give, our viewers some context, what does this mean, these two themes of law and debt restructuring? Well, again, the previous government passed over 100 laws in about 30 months, all with various implications given the current economic crisis in the country. Some of these laws dealt with how finance should be managed. Some of them were much more repressive in their orientation and their direction. So I think that it would be very useful, obviously, Ermiza, to get your perspective as well. And then, of course, in terms of the overlap with debt restructuring, during the election blackout period, right before the incoming government led by Kumar Dissanayake was elected, during that blackout period, there was an announcement of an agreement in principle with external creditors, with bondholders, regarding Sri Lanka's debt. And so that has a lot of contractual implications, but it also will obviously impact future options that Sri Lanka might consider for its development financing. So for that perspective, I think especially Ahilan, your perspective will be greatly appreciated. I just want to then open this up and maybe get into these questions. And again, I think the overall framing of this, the orientation is, what is this incoming government going to be able to do, right? How are they going to address some of these very big implications? And I guess we'll see. But to open it up, I'll start with you, Ahilan, and just ask a few opening questions. So the first is really, if Sri Lanka has now this newly elected president, Kumar Dissanayake, how do you see him taking forward the debt restructuring process?
Thank you, Devaka. So, as we all know, Sri Lanka is going through its worst economic crisis since independence. But what is even worse is that we have defaulted on our debt 2 years ago. And now we are in this process of trying to restructure that debt. After we defaulted, we also went into an IMF program. And while it is the 17th IMF program, this time it's different because now, this time the IMF is also the arbiter of debt restructuring. So what does debt restructuring mean? We couldn't repay our debt because we did not have enough foreign exchange. And we've accumulated a lot of debt. So the idea of debt restructuring is that we reduce that debt stock. So we discuss with our creditors. It might be countries like India, China, Japan, or a majority of our debt actually is owed to what are called bondholders. These are large financial institutions, hedge funds, mutual funds, who lend to countries, which we repay back in 5 years, 10 years, what are called international sovereign bonds. So now we don't have the foreign exchange to be able to repay all that. So we need them to reduce that debt, possibly lengthen the time frame over which we can repay that debt. So those are the negotiations. And Sri Lanka is not the only country in this kind of trouble. Over 10 countries have already defaulted on their debt, like Sri Lanka. Almost half the developing countries, over 70 countries, are in debt distress. So they're in danger of also defaulting. So in that context, we've elected a new president, but in a way, it's a very difficult moment for any president to take office now, because how do you address, this huge economic crisis, this large amount of debt stock that you inherit, now you have to figure out a way to repay it. Now, the debt restructuring process involves the IMF setting a framework or a set of parameters on the basis of which we negotiate with the creditors, right? And so for that, the IMF comes up with what's called a debt sustainability analysis. And there they say, okay, Sri Lanka should be able to pay this much after this many years. Now, many analysts, not just in Sri Lanka, international analysts have said that this analysis with respect to Sri Lanka is deeply flawed. Because according to this IMF debt sustainability analysis, Sri Lanka doesn't have to repay its loans for another 3-4 years. It's only when the IMF program comes to an end in 2027 that we would have to start repaying official creditors, that is the bilateral donors, and then also the bondholders. Of course, the multilateral agencies like the World Bank, ADB, and the IMF, we are continuing to repay their loans even today. Now, the IMF says after 4 years, every year, we would have to spend 4.5% of our GDP equivalent in both principal and interest payments of our debt stock. Now, what is 4.5% of GDP? According to the very same IMF framework, that would amount to about 30% of our revenues. Now, we've seen the VAT being increased, income taxes being increased to be able to increase our revenues. So what is the end goal? We are going to be repaying using those tax revenues. 30% of it is to repay loans. So where is the government spending, the public spending going to be for the people who've gone through this crisis? So that's a major issue. So the president, maybe it's difficult at the moment, he only has 3 parliamentarians in parliament. We are approaching parliament elections. Really needs to reconsider this IMF agreement. There are many provisions in there like this that are deeply flawed, and renegotiate that IMF agreement, possibly come up with new parameters, a new debt sustainability analysis on the basis of which we should start renegotiating with our creditors. Because the real danger, and Yukti organized a webinar recently, and we had Brad Setzer, who's a former US Treasury official, who said that it's very likely that Sri Lanka will default again once the IMF program is over. So all this suffering, and then we default again and we go through another cycle of this. Is that what we want? So we have to think long term, but the president needs to find the support to be able to do that. And I think it's really unfair that there is a lot of pressure being put on the president, on the new government that is to be formed, by very powerful international actors saying that stick to the IMF program, right? So I think we as a country need to come to a consensus that this is not the way forward, and our president needs to take that forward in negotiations.
So, I think that's a great overview, and, it will be, very helpful for folks to understand this given the complexity, right, of these issues. But I want to ask you then, based on that, it seems like there are already certain facts on the ground that have already been created by the previous administration that this new government is going to have to confront. Will they confront it? How will they confront it, is the question. And, you mentioned at the end, for example, this kind of popular pressure that is required. But it seems because there are so many different phases in these negotiations, and there are a lot of different creditors, right? There are the official creditors, the bilateral creditors, meaning, countries like the US, China, Japan. But then there are also these private actors, right? Such as the bondholders. And so, because especially the previous government was eager to get a deal done quickly, even before the election, as I mentioned in our introduction, in this, what was supposed to be a blackout period, right, for any kind of major news or developments that could impact the election, they announced an agreement in principle with bondholders. So given where the sort of state of play is, right, how the negotiations are continuing to play out, what room for pushback do you see could this government have, given that they announced this agreement in principle, and of course, Ermiza will talk about the legal implications, but, you know, are there any other avenues, I suppose, for kind of identifying what's at stake here? Because again, just so the viewers understand, Sri Lanka's debt, right, is being conflated between the external debt and the domestic debt. And if we're talking about who should pay, right, or how should, you know, the costs be distributed, right, it's very clear that the external creditors, especially the bondholders, need to take what's called a haircut. They need to take a bigger haircut on the total amount of money, basically value that they have. And so, you know, given that there's been this agreement in principle, Ahilan, I was wondering, how favorable is this to the bondholders, and what room for pushback do you really see here?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Devaka, because that just shows, even though the IMF would like to claim that this is a technical issue of parameters within which it's, debt restructuring is a deeply political issue, right? It's about power. And we saw that play out 2 weeks ago, right? In the middle of the election campaign, the IMF was making statements saying, oh, Sri Lanka is now on a stable path, to try to almost support the old government. Worse, we have 2 days of a blackout period when the election should not be influenced. And the president comes out and says he's reached a deal with the bondholders, right? Now, what is in that deal? It's, first of all, deeply unethical in terms of how it was brought into the public. Now, in previous months, in April, then in July, there were similar deals, negotiations with the bondholders. Now, the bondholders, the external debt that you mentioned, already the parameters set by the IMF don't ask for much relief. On top of that, what the bondholders have been putting forward, both in their July negotiations and in the September negotiations and the deal, is that they're saying if Sri Lanka's dollar GDP increases over the next 2 years, in 2025 to 2027, Sri Lanka should pay them more in terms of both the amount of the principal as well as a higher interest rate. And the key point here is also it's the dollar GDP. So our economy may not be growing, our economy may not be strengthening. If the Sri Lankan rupee, our exchange rate appreciates, if the rupee strengthens, then we would have to pay them more. Now, the rupee is very likely to strengthen because until the end of the IMF program, we are not repaying any loans. There's another flip side to it. When the rupee appreciates, it becomes that much more harder for us to export, right? Because our exports will cost much more in the global market. So actually our foreign earnings, our foreign exchange might decline, but we'll be expected to pay more in terms of the principal and the interest. So these are called macro-linked bonds, and they are deeply flawed, but they're all set up in the interests of creditors. This is the way in which the market is never a level playing field. It's always set in the interests of the powerful. And the IMF is in many ways there to guard the interests of these powerful creditors. So this deal in particular, I think the president and the government should take a strong stand and reject it. They should go and review it very carefully. They should relook at how debt restructuring has been happening and the negotiations with the bondholders, because I have absolutely no confidence in the previous President Ranil Wickremesinghe that he was negotiating in the interests of Sri Lanka. He was only interested in a deal to show a success story so that he can be re-elected. The people have overwhelmingly rejected him. And now this president has a new mandate, and he needs to move forward in renegotiation.
I mean, part of that, and thanks for that response, I think that, it's really how we frame these issues. As you mentioned, the market, it's not a level playing field, right? But then there are, of course, different ways in which these technical details are worked out, and not just economically, but also legally, right? And so we've already seen actually even the creditors themselves try to change the legal process, right, to make it more favorable, as Ahilan mentioned, and on their terms. So I guess, Ermiza, maybe this is also a good opportunity to ask this question, but I was wondering, in the same bond agreement that we've just been discussing, it says, quote, "A mechanism to change the governing law of the New York law govern new securities to English or Delaware law with the consent of a supermajority of bondholders, if proposed by holders of 20% of any particular series of the new securities, was also agreed." Now, that quote there is just to give you an idea that this is being done in also a legal way, right, to change the law. Because again, these bonds, if they're issued obviously in places like the US, right, they're governed by different legal frameworks, right? So what does it mean potentially that they're actually trying to change the law, again, with the implication being to make it more favorable to creditors? So I guess I was wondering, given that this is all just in principle and theory, I was wondering if you could also enlighten us on what might be some possible directions. And again, how might the law be used as well to deal with these issues around debt restructuring?
Thank you, Devaka. I think it's important to understand that these agreements, even the agreement with the IMF when it was entered into by Sri Lanka, that the people of Sri Lanka or their representatives did not really have that opportunity to scrutinize and did not really fully utilize that opportunity to fully scrutinize the agreement and understand the implications that such agreements would have on the lives of people and the future of our economy and our ability to develop, right? So in that context where we do not have transparency and accountability in entering agreements and revising agreements, that is the context in which these negotiations have happened. In fact, the laws that have been proposed and passed in the last several months have been what we call undemocratically put forward. And so the same goes for these agreements as well. And in the context of this particular one and the clause that you read out, the Sri Lankan people, the representatives of the previous parliament, have not really scrutinized it. And here we see much debate and commentary internationally about a clause that will potentially allow bondholders to opt out of the law that is applicable to that agreement and to choose a law which clearly will be more favorable to them. There is also a reason for such a clause because there is a push, there is advocacy for a new law in the state of New York called the Sovereign Debt Stability Act, which has been proposed and which has not yet passed into law, right? If that law were to come into effect and the creditors know that it's coming, it would really have implications on how debt restructuring, particularly when there is a default, happens. The law is being introduced by various actors who are pushing for it to ensure that indebted nations like Sri Lanka go through a much more structured process, and that the rationale is that it will be streamlined. These long drawn negotiations which do not favor poorer countries like us at the negotiating table will be minimized. So in fact, the legislative intent of the law that has been proposed reads like this: to support orderly, collaborative, and effective international sovereign debt relief for countries with unsustainable levels of debt. Debt distress, debt crises, and disorderly default are associated with unacceptable human suffering, economic decline, and financial market and payment system disruption. So the language of the intent of the law is clear. It recognizes that there is human suffering annexed to these debt negotiations. So in the context of these regulations coming in to oversee, to supervise these debt restructuring agreements, the creditors are getting ahead of it and saying, in the event there is an issue to be resolved, we want to be able to use some other law to govern this dispute, not the law that will have all these formulas by which we will be forced to then possibly take, let's say, a higher haircut for that matter, right? So the legal components of this, and this is just one clause, so I'm sure there are many clauses to be looked into and understand the implications of, but you also see what kind of game is at play in these negotiations.
If I can come in also on an additional point, Devaka, is the discussion these last 2 years, because as I mentioned, so many countries are defaulting, are in debt distress, and this act by various organizations to, somehow constrain the creditors, right? These bondholders who are like vultures, to be honest, right? They are even, the Hamilton Federal Bank is actually trying to sue Sri Lanka, right? As a way to have no debt relief. Yeah. So these are the kind of laws that would protect countries like Sri Lanka. Yeah. And then when Sri Lanka goes and signs a deal like this, it sets a very bad precedent. This becomes the norm then for other developing countries. So, what we were thinking over the last 2 years, what Sri Lanka needs to do is to find solidarity with other countries where people are going through such suffering, right? Form maybe a debtors coalition, for example, so we can bargain better. Let's think of better avenues of development financing, right? So we can all rise up together. Instead of that, this is a huge betrayal of the global South and other developing countries. We don't want this label on Sri Lanka, the country that betrayed the other developing countries in order that one president wanted to make a deal. I mean, that will be Ranil Wickremesinghe's legacy.
Just to add in terms of a technicality, last year Suriname entered into a similar agreement, and we saw this similar clause for the first time. However, in that agreement, we know that Suriname did have a veto power if there was an opt-out clause to the applicable law. So whether Sri Lanka actually will have that, it doesn't look like it does at the moment, so we will be in a more vulnerable position. And it also, as Ahilan said, then sets precedent for other agreements for other countries to come in the future. So it's a new thing.
Yeah. I want to thank you both for your responses, because I think that really grounds it for people that, if you just read these agreements, or, just read the sort of the official text, you kind of have to read between the lines, right? To really understand all the different strategies, right? The implications for power, right? And Ermiza, I think that's really useful how you described it, that, it's almost like the bondholders are trying to preempt, right, these possible changes that would be more favorable, right, to debt-distressed countries, defaulting countries. But it's also interesting because I think, as Ahilan mentioned, this intersects, there's always an intersection between the international and the domestic, right? And so the agendas, both personal and public, of the previous president, they're going to have implications, consequences for even this incoming government. So on that note, we started this roundtable also by briefly mentioning that over 100 laws were passed in about 30 months under the previous administration. And again, I want to emphasize that after the uprising in July of 2022, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa was ejected from power, essentially by the people, it became clear that this parliament, the parliament that has just been dissolved, was delegitimized, right? But the president, meaning Ranil Wickremesinghe, was able to use that parliament to essentially still pass all these laws. So my question, again for you, Ermiza, is, what do you see is possible for this new government to address these laws and even bring about changes or repeal them? And again, they cover a wide variety of topics, right? They deal with economic issues, but of course, even international human rights groups were, focused on the repressive implications. Obviously, a lot of lobbying and advocacy work being done here on the ground, right? Around the Online Safety Act, right? The Bureau of Rehabilitation Act. So I was just wondering, what do you think, again, is possible even in terms of, changing or repealing these laws?
Devak, I think that's an important question also going into the parliamentary elections. We know that the laws that were passed in the last 30 months were spearheaded by a president that did not have the mandate of the people, were passed by a parliament that did not have the confidence of the people, that was very much the show of what people demonstrated with the 2022 uprising, right, or the Aragalaya. In that context, there were so many laws, like almost over 3 laws a month. It is hard to understand with very little notice in the way that it's passed. So we know that the laws that were passed were extremely repressive. We've studied them, we've challenged them in courts, people have advocated against some of these laws, and have deep impacts, not immediate as well, but also for Sri Lanka's future in terms of what kind of direction Sri Lanka is taking as a country, economically, socially, in terms of our labor rights, many areas. I think as Yukti has already made a statement on this issue, whether it's an incoming president or an incoming parliament, there is a real responsibility to review all of the laws that were passed in this period of time. And on those laws that are completely unnecessary, completely detrimental, there is a responsibility to consider complete repeal of those laws. The Online Safety Act is one such law. Bureau of Rehabilitation is another act. We also have laws that were pending, that were proposed and were pending, and those should not be taken forward. So, for example, the anti-terrorism bill that was put forward. There was also discussions around new labor laws, a united series of labor laws that was deeply problematic from the little bit that we saw in terms that were given to us, right? There was talk of a new NGO bill to replace the current Voluntary Social Services Organizations Act. And these had very repressive provisions. They also have a lot of provisions that increased criminal offenses, which meant there were many more tools by which the policing of this country could also oppress people. We really need to move away from that. I think we'll have to look at both the process by which laws are enacted. So any incoming parliament would have to adopt a very different approach to new laws, where it's more consultative, there is more transparency, there is more time for people to study and engage, and not be afraid of dissent and constructive criticism. And then only adopt laws that speak to people's issues and problems and what they are looking to see in terms of a change. So there is a real need to review, to repeal problematic laws, at least in the last 30 months that were passed, but I'm sure there are laws that Sri Lanka needs to review from much further back. And then also, I must not forget to mention the economic transformation bill that also went through. So I think that deeply problematic in terms of land rights, in terms of workers' rights, in terms of environmental and other considerations on these economic zones that were going to be created across the country. So lots of responsibility, but it is not something that can be set aside because laws are intrinsically attached to how we are governed as citizens. And that is the social contract. So it is very necessary that those corrections, course corrections, are made by incoming parliaments, and also leadership is given by the incoming government.
Yeah.
I want to add to what Ermiza said, particularly about this economic transformation bill. I mean, I don't think people have seen this in other countries. They actually mention the IMF targets.
Right.
You know, that Sri Lanka should not exceed 95% of GDP in terms of total debt, debt servicing of 4.5%, to reify, you know, these are targets, these are questionable targets, numbers into law, the ridiculousness of it. But the more ironic thing is that then the IMF welcomes that, right? So we know that over the last 2 years, it is the IMF's recommendations and then its benchmarks as per its agreement that is Sri Lankan policy. That was bad enough. And now it's creeping into law, right? So there is a lot we need to take stock of in terms of how we want to move forward.
So I guess that's the big question, you know, given how much has been entrenched, and it's no longer even just in the policy framework, right? It's becoming entrenched in law, which makes it even more challenging. But still, as you mentioned, there needs to be a leadership, right, and a vision for how they're going to any given party, right, or coalition that truly wants to represent the people, right? How are they going to push back? So I wanted to, you know, end our discussion with sort of a final broad question, and I know initially this was going to focus more on sort of the economic front, but I really want to just broaden it. You know, so again, the IMF program, as you just mentioned, Ahilan, ultimately seeks to return Sri Lanka back to the commercial market. And again, just to give the background, it was these sovereign borrowings that essentially caused the crisis in the first place, right? But the IMF agreement anticipates that Sri Lanka will return to the same capital markets, I believe, by 2027. What does this mean for Sri Lanka, particularly for its development financing? But also, I suppose, if I could try and think through some of these other implications, you know, what kinds of mobilization are possible as well for a more democratic relationship between the state and society, right? Because we're talking on several different levels, right? We're talking on the international level, what alternatives are available, but then we're also talking domestically, what kinds of popular forces, ways in which, you know, the relationship between state and society can be reorganized to push for alternatives. And so, you know, again, I know that link, you know, we need to clarify, but, you know, Ermiza, you mentioned the word social contract. And I think that phrase, it's really important, right? So what, you know, in addition to development financing, the international question, you know, domestically as well, what is possible, whether it's in terms of, you know, abolishing the executive presidency, decentralizing funding, ensuring that development happens in the regions and the provinces under, you know, structures of devolution. You know, what are the different ways in which all these issues can connect? And is there a vision really for an alternative? So I just open it up for both of you, and please feel free.
Maybe I'll start,
Yeah,
and I'm
go
sure Ermiza will have a lot to say. This is a big question, but maybe I'll start with the concrete, right? Why is this IMF program so flawed and unsuitable for Sri Lanka? Because its entire goal, and it's etched in the program itself, is when Sri Lanka exits the IMF program, after that, every year, we are going to float 1.8% of GDP in sovereign bonds. Every year. In 2027, that would mean a 1.5 billion US dollar, and after that, that'll keep increasing. So in other words, we are going to repay the donors 4.5% of GDP, and we are going to be borrowing 1.8% to be able to then repay that 4.5%. And Sri Lanka being a country that has defaulted, we are probably going to pay a very high interest on those huge bonds that we take. So this whole program is just taking Sri Lanka back into a debt trap, in my view. But it serves the interests of creditors. It serves the market interests that the IMF safeguards. Right. So this is no way forward for the development of our country. So then comes the question, what kind of development financing, what kind of development path are we looking at? Now, as we said, this is a very difficult moment for a president and a government to come. The next many weeks, with parliamentary elections ahead, there's going to be debates and fights and, the whole circus of elections in a way, but important debates will also happen there. My view is that once the parliamentary elections are over and a new government has been formed, we should have a national conference. Bring in all the actors. Bring in the economists, bring in the farmers, bring in the political actors, and let's take stock of what's happened to our economy. This is a historic moment. We've never been in such a deep crisis. Let's take stock of what's happened, what have we lost, and how we are going to move forward. Do we want to keep moving in the same direction? Is commercial borrowing the way forward?
Right.
Are we going to have more redistribution so that maybe implement things like a wealth tax so that we invest in our people? Are we going to make alliances so that we get concessional financing? Because at this high interest rates, there's no way forward. The question you asked about power. How are we going to move towards a people-centered politics? Will there be power sharing? Would the minorities feel that they have a stake in this state and the kind of development that's going forward? Look at the tragedy of what's happened to our hill country Tamils. Within a year of independence, we denied them citizenship. To this day, they live in horrible housing conditions. What is their future going to look like? That should be front and center when we're talking about development. They should have a place in that conference to air their views about what kind of development we need. We need to devolve power to the regions because we're going through this horrible food crisis. There is poverty has doubled, malnutrition, right? Food shortages in so many families, they're only eating 1 or 2 meals a day. But if we are to revamp agriculture, to give importance to our food system, we have to not only invest in it, we have to give power to those food producers. That is what devolution is about. So we have a lot of thinking to do before we can move forward.
Devak, on the question of the social contract that you picked up on, I think there's a real need to change the foundational blocks, and that's not an easy task. So we are looking at constitutional change and building that kind of public trust to trust this process forward, right? So social contract is not something I think that any incoming representatives or government can merely demonstrate, but it'll take time. In those foundational blocks, we see that we need to recognize in any new constitution, it can't be a tinkering of the existing one. We need fundamental changes such as the recognition of economic, social rights as justiciable rights in the country. That is where there is a cry from the people, whether it's labor, whether it's economic rights, whether it's housing, whether it's education. Those rights have to be justiciable and properly accessible to people. We also do need to see an end to the executive presidency that has really plagued this country since this constitution that has come, that we currently have. And we need to have fundamental changes like bringing in post-enactment judicial review, whereby citizens can participate in changing laws whenever they feel there is a need to. Whenever they feel that the law is impinging on their rights, they're able to take that grievance to a court and say, this particular provision now no longer serves the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution that are mine. So that conversation, that space to have that conversation needs to be created by a new constitution. And it is only then when people feel that ability, are able to participate in also with that power sharing that has to come in, that there will be the resurgence or there's a building up of this new social contract that is much needed. So these are not easy things to do. These are big ideas, but it's not impossible. Political will has not been there for these major changes. And we're really looking for that difference for the people. A country is only as good as it can protect the weakest of the population. So there are segments of Sri Lanka's population that are extremely marginalized, like the workers in the plantation. Then we have domestic workers. We have, whether it's agriculture, whether it's low-income housing communities, we have many different types of groups which face different types of vulnerabilities and marginalization. Then we have the minorities in terms of identity, minoritized identities, right? It's by ensuring that these vulnerable groups feel secure, that we can demonstrate that we are an adequate enough country and that we have the systems in place to protect our population.
These were really extremely compelling answers, and I think a lot of food for thought. One thing, just to kind of summarize what I see based on what you both have just mentioned, is that, you know, this process, and it is a process, right? As you point out, Ermiza, like, it's in many ways an extension, right, of the spirit of the uprising of 2022, right? And so as much as the narrative, the emphasis has been about stability, in fact, what we also need to think about is change, right? And in what direction, and what principles. And I think this connects too to the historic wrongs that have been committed against marginalized communities, minority communities. But yet there is still this possibility, right, of again, a new social contract, right? If it's based on values of egalitarianism, justice, freedom, right? And so I think we're gonna, you know, as Ahilan mentioned, there will be kind of the circus of politics, but then there will also be these ongoing debates in both in the background and hopefully also in the foreground about, you know, not just which party wins, you know, in parliament, but also how people are going to be involved and through what struggles. And so, again, a lot of complex issues surrounding these two broad themes of law and debt restructuring. But I just want to thank both of you for your expertise, for your commitment, and for your engagement. And yes, and you know, I hope you all found it useful. I know I did. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you.
joining us.